In fraud and financial crime, the question of how is the key to a lot of what we need to understand.
I'm excited to share a very special conversation with you today. We're going beyond algorithms and analytics to explore the human side of financial crime with Dr. Nicola Harding, a noted criminologist and social researcher based in the UK who studies fraud through the lens of human behavior, lived experience, and the mechanics of how fraud works. Nicola has spent years bridging worlds that rarely speak to each other directly: industry, law enforcement, victims, and even former fraudsters. She's now building a new nonprofit, Financial Crime Lab, with a mission to turn research into action against financial crime. Not by guessing, not by assumption, but by evidence people can actually use. In this conversation, Nicola breaks down why fraud often isn't gold standard data, why the missing feedback loop matters, and why awareness isn't just education, it's disruption. If you work in fraud, risk, product, identity, or trust and safety, this episode will change how you think about the fight. Welcome to DataTalk. I'm Kathleen Peters, Chief Innovation Officer of Experian, Identity, and Fraud, and your host for the Fraud Frontlines podcast series. Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Nicola Harding, a noted criminologist and social researcher based in the UK. We'll talk about understanding fraud through the lens of human behavior. Nicola, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So you've spent a number of years studying behaviors behind fraud. Share with me a little bit more about your background and what first drew you to this area of criminology.
I came into fraud, I would say accidentally. I used to joke that I'd been kidnapped into it, really. I'll explain why shortly. But it was really through a mix of academic curiosity, because I am a secret geek. I'm an academic at heart, maybe not so much of a secret geek, but really my expertise lies in lived experience. So I've always been interested in why people make the choices that they do, especially choices that can lead not only to harm to others, but harm to themselves as well. I've studied a whole range of different topics as a criminologist. I started off being really interested in things like the city and graffiti and why we live our lives the way that we do, and why some places are dangerous or some people are seen as dangerous. And then I started to hone that in more on how we respond to those people. So how women particularly experience criminal justice, prison, how they experienced, being on probation and things like that, and how we then dealt with the problem or the troublemakers, if you like. From there, I realised that people with lived experience are some of the key to the problem and understanding the problem of crime. And it was from there, really, that I kind of took that idea of what can we learn from lived experience, and not only what can we learn from it, because criminology and academics, especially in the UK, I think just to clarify, there's kind of a few different types of criminology. And in America, for example, criminology would be a lot more about statistics. You're a much bigger population than we are. So a lot of studies would be done by looking at the size of the prison population or how much money is being lost. We would look at things at scale, so that real big data. The criminal justice system in the UK doesn't really have big data, because our data is within 44 different police forces who are a lot smaller. So it's a different scale of problem, but the harm is perhaps somewhat greater. So criminologists in the UK really come at the problem of crime from more of a trying to understand the person who's committed it, or their cultural or their kind of structures in society that have allowed it to happen. So that's the kind of fundamental base that I was working on. But the thing for me was that there was always someone missing out of the conversation. And that was people who've actually been there and done it. Not only the victims who were beginning to get a platform through a form of criminology called victimology, but actually the people who, the convicted fraudsters or the white collar criminals, we would study them around them. We would study the figures around them, and then we would lock them up or dispose of them in a different way within the criminal justice system. And we might ask questions of why, what happened in your childhood? Is there anything psychologically wrong with you as to why you've got there? But we would never ask them how. And in fraud and financial crime, the question of how is the key to a lot of what we need to understand. It's not only how did you become a fraudster so that we can potentially stop further people going into fraud and financial crime, but how did you do it? How did you spot the vulnerabilities? Like, how did you see there was a weakness there? Because it's not luck, and it's not something innate about these people that they were just born bad and they were always going to be these financial criminals. But actually, there's a reason, and because the how question wasn't being asked, it left a significant knowledge gap in my experience. And the only way we can do that is almost by getting over ourselves a little bit and kind of going, oh, what can a fraudster tell me? Unfortunately, quite a lot. And therefore we need to ask the question. So that's what brought me in. But ultimately, I didn't go to university till I was 28. I've got 5 children. I was a single mum with 4 children when I did my undergraduate degree. And I come from a background that is more criminal than academic. I grew up in communities that are disproportionately affected by both crime as perpetrators, but also as victims. So I have lived experience of crime and justice and victimization that predate me being an academic. I wanted to become a criminologist. I didn't even know I wanted to become one when I went to study, but ultimately I became one because my curiosity was, how do we make sense of a world where I believe that people aren't born bad and that things happen and that's what leads us down a specific path? If that's the case and my hypothesis is real and there isn't good or bad people, there's just circumstances, then surely we can change the circumstances and we can make the world a better and safer place. And that's always been my driving force, is how do we make things better, not just for us right now, but for future generations. I don't want my children to be living the same reality where here in the UK, 40% of all crime that's even reported is fraud. It shouldn't be the case. And so that's my mission as a criminologist, is to try and use research, insight and understanding to tip the balance in favor of us and not the criminals.
You bring such a fascinating and unique lens, Nick, to the study of this. Thank you for sharing that background. It's really, really fascinating. I like what you talked about there with that lived experience and even some of your own lived experience and the communities in which these crimes are being perpetrated, formed, developed over time. I think when we talk about fraud, especially in financial crime, and maybe it is that US bias that you mentioned, we're thinking about technology, data at scale, machine learning models, and these are all very powerful tools, obviously. But understanding that human element is a really important piece of the puzzle to solving this and solving it systematically. That's what I'm hearing in terms of your research and your focus, is how we understand that missing part of the overall system of studying how fraud occurs.
There's not, for me, and I think perhaps there's some storytelling around how we have human behavior on the one side and then we've got technology on the other. We're always going to turn to technology for the answer because technology can upscale. And when you're dealing with populations, the size of the US and other parts of the world, if I'm a criminologist saying, oh, but what about this story of this one person over here? It's a bit like, well, you're talking about a needle in a haystack. And I guess what I'm trying to unlock is the knowledge that makes it a haystack full of needles and not the needle in the haystack. And when you have the right data, technology is a wonderful thing and I'll never take away from it, because what it's going to allow us to do is, when we can get the right balance of human understanding and put that into the technologies that we have available, or even the technologies that we haven't thought of yet, then we're going to really be able to change the world for the better. But we need that baseline understanding. Any data scientist knows your data and your AI and your large language learning models are only as good as the data that you put in them.
That's
I
right.
had, in talking about human relationships, my 9-year-old daughter, her dad is a doctor of artificial intelligence, and we're no longer together. But that might be part of the dynamic of having someone that is so extremely human focused and someone that is so extremely data led. But we learn from each other in that process, and I really learned that actually there is so much promise out of AI. And, we've been using AI for such a long time now, longer than we've ever been talking about in the press. We've used
Yes,
it
sure.
set the prices of petrol or gas, as it may be in the US. We've we've used it to help us to plan how we should resource things like, the NHS or our hospitals and things like that, stuff that we simply could not do by hand anymore because of the
Right,
scale. So
right.
there's absolutely no way to kind of say, oh, ignore technology, it's not good for us, because it really does play a vital role. But ultimately, when it comes to fraud and financial crime, the data is not good. And that's not to say that it's bad because of the levels of crime. It's just that we simply don't have a gold standard data set with fraud. And I
It's
think,
insufficient, right? It's insufficient. Yeah.
well, we're guessing, right? Because we don't
Yes.
actually know. So every time, if we think about, and I'll forgive me for talking about in the UK terms, but there will be equivalents in the US, is that if you're in a financial institution and you've got a suspicion that something's fraud or some suspicious activity, you will log a SAR, a suspicious activity report.
Same
And
here.
from that will go away and it will be sent into law enforcement. It'll go to the National Crime Agency here. And they will take that intelligence, and if it feeds into something they've already found, or maybe they're getting multiple reports of the same thing, they will then go and act on it. What doesn't happen is that when they've acted on it, there will be an investigation, and that investigation will decide, was it fraud? Was it something else? Is it going to get prosecuted? Then the Crown Prosecution Service will decide, is it in the public interest to prosecute? And actually, is it even fraud that we're going to prosecute for? Or is it serious organised crime? Is it terrorism? Is it something else? If it eventually gets that far and gets to the criminal justice system and someone is locked up, nobody goes back and says, okay, so we go back to here and we tell them that they got it right, and we go back to here. And then that a financial institution gets told that suspicion that you had was the touch paper that lit this whole investigation, and we proved it was fraud. So therefore, please tell your models that you got it right. And it also doesn't do it when you get it
Right,
wrong, or
right.
when there's no resolution. All you know is the rules you've put in, or the AI that you've used, or the whatever it is that's made it seem suspicious, which could be the bank teller, the someone in branch. They could have gone, you know what? I know that person, and that just doesn't seem like how they should, how they should be acting. There's something seems off, and they filled in that suspicious activity report. We're never graded on it. We're never told, like, tick, ding. And if we were, that would give us gold standard data on fraud that then we could act on and look on more. So instead, we have technology firms that are reaching for things like synthetic data, which, is a great alternative, a safer way of trying to train some of the models. But ultimately, where are they getting the intelligence from to train or to create that synthetic data to train those models? Like, what insight are we giving technology to make that technology work for us in the way that we want it to? And as a criminologist, I would say that there is not enough at the moment deep insight into criminal activity feeding into technology in our systems in order to be able to say, it's all right, the technology's got it, we can rest. So for me, that's why we need more human insight. It's not about changing hearts and minds because the newspaper printed that story of, 83-year-old Emily who lost her life savings in this scam or that scam. It's about taking those real world insights, finding, what did the fraudsters do? How did they do that? Where could we see that? Who could have been the first to see that? Is it going to be in the bank or financial institution? Or is it going to be in the email inbox? Or is it going to be the telco provider? And being able to give that information back so that they can create better systems.
I know you collaborated with, as you said, law enforcement, with businesses, some red teaming, with victims. I remember a film that you had shared at another conference that we were both at, where you had worked with the young person, the person who had committed this kind of scam or crime when it came to stealing phones, for example, and the access to those devices. I remember you said you worked with that very young perpetrator who in some ways themselves are a victim, right? Being used by more organized criminal gangs or what have you. How did you think about those experiences? I assume you had to build a level of trust with someone like that young person so that they could share that experience and then be willing to participate in filming this so that it could be education for law enforcement and for business.
Yeah, I mean, as a researcher, that's generally what we are. We're always a bit of the middleman. We are helping people tell their stories for whatever purpose. And usually the researcher is there to try and be impartial or to try and, identify the social issues that we need to look at and then find the right storytellers. There's a real power in telling stories. And what I found when it comes to the people who have either perpetrated crime or have been victims, storytelling's really cathartic. It gives people not only an opportunity to tell their side of the story, reframe themselves from victims to someone who can help prevent someone else becoming a future victim. And that goes for both victim and perpetrator. There's a concept called restorative justice, and I firmly believe in it. I think it has far more impact than most of the types of punishment that we put in the criminal justice system. And in a process of restorative justice, what happens traditionally is both sides of the argument, so the victim and the perpetrator, get together in a mediated setting, and the perpetrator apologises. And you might think, well, words are cheap. Like, why does that matter? It's so much harder for a perpetrator to face what they've done and to apologise from it in a meaningful way, and to have to sit there and listen to the victim tell them that the harm that they've done, that's so much harder for them to do than for them to just go and sit in a cell, go to the gym, maybe be put on probation. They're all inconveniences. They may change their lives for a bit, but it's not going to fundamentally change who they are. Storytelling, and also for the victim, being able to feel heard, that their trauma that they went through because of what happened to them has been heard and felt in some way, not at the same level that they would have felt it, but in a way that makes them feel like they have been heard. That forms justice. And it's something that our criminal justice systems don't do very well, because in criminology, we kind of theorize this, but we talk about how if there's a conflict, say, between a fraud victim and a fraudster, there's been this dispute, which we call a crime. We hand all the evidence over to the criminal justice system and we say, make that better. And we never give it back to the victim and offender to say, here, we've made it better now. Can you kind of reconcile your differences or what have you? We do it with kids in school. We might pull them to one side. You imagine two little boys scrapping in the playground. We'll pull them to one side. We'll give them a talking to. And then we'll walk them over to each other and we'll say, no, you apologise and you apologise. And they'll go, I'm sorry. And they probably won't mean it in the moment, but it ends the dispute. We never do that in the criminal justice system. And there's a real power in having, for a victim, being seen and heard, and for a perpetrator in having to apologise and actually face what they've done. And we think that happens in court, but it doesn't. Court is such a traumatic experience, or for those that have been through it.
Unnatural, yeah.
Or those who've been through it many, many times, they switch off, whereas actually they can't switch off when facing their victim. So I believe that the role of storytelling is that you're giving an opportunity for someone who's been through the process as a perpetrator in redemption. It gives them a way of, not that you're offering them redemption, but a way of redeeming themselves, that they are starting to do the building blocks of putting, I guess, what they've done wrong to, of righting their wrongs, essentially. And for the victim, you're importantly letting them feel heard when the system itself has kind of, put them to the back burner, is not giving them a voice. So the power of storytelling in that, there's that for the individuals, but in terms of what it does for society, fraudsters, active fraudsters, not the ones who want to say sorry, but those who are at it right now, they don't want you to talk about fraud. They do not want you to share what they did. They don't want to make it visible, because the whole, like, I guess the best tool for them is secrecy. We talk about in the war, loose lips sink ships. And it's the same with fraud, because ultimately a fraudster's like MO, the way they do things, if that stays secret because the victim's too ashamed to say anything, or we just don't talk about it because we don't talk about these things, it's not the done thing, they can do it to someone else. But if you sing, shout about it and say, this is how criminals are going to try and get you, and we make it really well known, they can't do that anymore. They've got to adapt and they've got to do something else. Awareness campaigns play a really important role in that, and storytelling plays a huge role in that.
I think that's absolutely right. I know you talked about that too, and we think about scams in particular. A big element of the scam is the shame often that the victim will feel for having been caught out, or believing what the fraudster has told them, or how could I have been so stupid? I should have known better. And like you said, the fraudsters hide behind that shame. They want those victims to feel shame so that they can continue to perpetrate, and there isn't that awareness that these scams are out there. I think that's why there is a lot of campaign activity that we are seeing from financial institutions and from public safety awareness to help increase the storytelling and the dialogue around scams, so that we can help people cope with some of that shame and not continue to have this go unreported.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you think about it, people trust people more than they trust systems. That's a lot of what fraudsters, play upon, isn't it? So
right,
those peer-to-peer conversations, then they cut through that fear and shame, and they normalize the fact that anyone can be manipulated. So technology can flag risks. Again, still a role for it here. But conversation can change behavior. And we're in this digital first world, but the human voice is still the most powerful tool and intervention that we have when it comes to fraud and financial crime.
So tell us about your new nonprofit, Financial Crime Lab. What inspired its creation? What are you doing? What is your core mission there with Financial Crime Lab?
So for me, it was a natural progression of what I was already doing. I was really focused when at We Fight Fraud on how do we bring proper deep insight into the conversation about fraud and financial crime, that we shouldn't be, where we can, we shouldn't be working from guesses, we shouldn't be working from assumptions, we should be working from evidence. But that evidence is only good, it only matters if it's accessible, and prevention can only work if people can see themselves in it. So I always talk about the Financial Crime Lab is on a mission to turn research into action against financial crime. And my aim is to do that by bringing together practitioners, survivors, technologists, other academics, because I'm not the only one doing this. I'm not on a, I sometimes feel like I'm on a one-woman mission, but I'm not. There is a whole kind of pool of expertise and knowledge in this area of really dedicated people who want to make a difference in the world. And that's who I want to bring together. And it's why it's a not-for-profit, because ultimately it's about how do we build these insights and how do we build an evidence base that we don't just keep locked in, one intervention or one, behind a paywall or in a book on a shelf that nobody's going to read. How do we take these insights and give them to the people who are best placed to use them? And a lot of the time, we think about the first line of defense against financial crime or fraud, and we talk about our first line practitioners in the bank. It's not them. They're second line. The first line is all of us, because we are the people who are facing it every day. And even your, scam victim that's been scammed out of, 150,000 and, have lost their life savings and whatnot, they're not a fool. It didn't happen to them because they're stupid. It happened to them because fraudsters have advanced their practice over a long time. They share knowledge faster than we do, and they use everything at their fingertips to be an advantage. But think about all the times that that person didn't get scammed. Think about all the times that they did identify it, or that all they did was slip up once to become that victim. And ultimately, a key part of them becoming a survivor is, how do we create the conditions for them to tell their stories, to share that information, to share it with us, and to share it with everyone so that they can be part of that first line of defence? Because ultimately, we're all professionals in this area, and we've got privileged knowledge and know how to protect ourselves on the whole. And it can happen to all of us easily. But we've got children, and we've got parents that we are looking after in their old age, or siblings that maybe, go around giving out all their personal data in exchange for, free gifts or whatever it might be.
Right, exactly.
We are all navigating this same landscape together. So we have to see it as the whole fraud and financial crime, a whole society project. We have to involve everyone.
So who's your primary audience then? Is it that first line of defense, that public awareness? Or is it also the second line of defense, the corporates, the fraud investigative teams? Who will benefit from the information that Financial Crime Lab is going to be providing?
I think ultimately the idea is that it'll be everyone, but it'll be filtered through our fraud and financial crime professionals in all different organisations. I currently work across critical infrastructure, so not just financial services. Often we see that fraud and financial crime is like dealt with by financial services, because ultimately the buck stops with them. It's
Right.
usually the end of the road. I've always said with crime, like, by the time you get to the criminal justice system, you're too late. Things have already gone wrong in the social system for us to end up there. It's the same with fraud and financial crime. By the time the bank's dealing with it, like, a whole load of stuff's gone beforehand. And hence critical infrastructure plays a real key role in that, in terms of, even down to like your National Post Service, your telecommunication providers, Starlink, Meta, Facebook, all of these different things, your water provider, all of these different structures, they hold our data, they become vulnerabilities, but they can also become our greatest strength. So there's key kind of risk managers, fraud and financial crime professionals in those roles, but also financial services. I work a lot with governments. An advisor to the Home Office here in the UK, continually badger the government with details from our research, specifically so that they can make better informed decisions. So the Financial Crime Lab is ultimately to be a resource for those people who are best placed. And some of them do talk directly to consumers. I also do a lot of work, critical infrastructure, but I also do an awful lot of press as well. And ultimately, the way I see it is the press doesn't really want to hear from me. They want to hear, directly from those victims or former fraudsters or whatever, those interesting stories that we can tell. But if I can be a conduit for that happening, I want everyone talking about fraud, but I want our professionals to be talking about it from a place of certainty and from a place of intelligence and from a place of support as well, because it's not just simply about passively giving that information and then saying do what you will. The Financial Crime Lab will be a community for people to come ask the questions, to upskill themselves, to help them craft their careers so that they're going to be most impactful. Because some of the most committed and passionate people that I've ever met work in fraud and financial crime prevention, because ultimately they're not here for the money, because if they were, they'd probably take what they know and join the criminals and join the other side. But
they're well educated on that now by now. Yeah,
exactly. When your day to day is being exposed to the fact that there are very much easier ways of making money, but you make that moral choice to be on the right side of this.
Yes.
There's no industry like fraud and financial crime prevention. If you think about it, every other industry, your competitor is other organisations working in your field. If you're a retailer selling clothes, then your competitors are other designers selling clothes in other retailers. In fraud and financial crime prevention, our competitor is the criminal. We are united, and the enemy of our enemy is our friend. Therefore, we are a community unlike no other. And it's a community that, in my opinion, needs to be supported, but given the best tools available. And that's what I believe that I can do, and the other professionals that I work with in the Financial Crime Lab can do. Is our role in this is giving that intelligence that can be actioned, giving that support, and acting as a facilitator to ensure that our army against the scammers and against criminals is as fit as they can be under our support.
Yeah, it's a great point that you make. I completely agree, and I see that when you meet other people, they're proud to be fraud fighters. It's a mission-driven type of existence where we can't stop thinking about it at night. We wake up excited about what we might discover today that could make some difference. What is a story that we could tell? It's why I'm talking to you today, because I'm so fascinated by this myself. And I feel like there's an important mission to get the word out and to do everything that we can to continue to fight fraud. I agree with you. It's definitely a unique set of people where even individuals from competing companies will come together and want to share ideas and share stories and do some venting and even have some moral support in the fight, because it's a unique way that we come together. That's for sure. You mentioned media, and you were recently featured on BBC Three during Scam Safe Week. There was a story about Miles Hart. Can you share a little bit about that, or what's a takeaway that you feel is important from the story of Miles Hart?
Yeah, there was a load of different things that really intrigued me about Miles, and ultimately, it was interesting the way that I got involved, actually, because he's not been prosecuted, so he's not a prosecuted offender, although there is definitely a worrying amount of evidence in terms of what he may or may not have been up to. So I guess we have to kind of precursor all this that it's alleged.
Alleged, right? Yes, right,
Yeah,
right. And he's at law. Yes, it's alleged at this point, right? And
yeah,
maybe share a little bit about the story. I'm not sure if folks will know
yeah.
the
So
story.
how I came to be involved with it was that one of his friends that had grown up with him, certain things had happened that seemed a bit strange and had impacted on them and their close friendship group. But what they began to unpick when they went back to a place that he lived, they found this box, and this is where I was brought in. They found a box and it had like over 150 bank cards for him.
Physical box with the
Physical
physical cards
cards.
inside.
Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah. And so they were like, what is going on? Because they didn't realize, I guess, the size and scale. They knew that he'd been living beyond his means, that he had probably done a few things. I think you can probably all imagine someone in your community or in your group that you kind of think, if there was going to be one of us that would turn out to be a fraudster or someone dodgy, it's probably that person, even if they're not, because they exaggerate too much or they live beyond their means, that all of these different things, like telltale signs that when you look back on them, she was like, of course, that was the case.
right.
But she brought me the evidence and she talked a little bit about him as a man. So I was kind of kept in the dark a little bit as to the whole story, just given the overlying. And then we agreed to meet on camera and she
And just to be clear, the cards in the box, those bank cards, they weren't just random cards. They were his friends, their mates,
they were
their group, right?
They were him, his friends. They were individuals that were known, and there was multiple accounts. So it wasn't a case of he's gone and stolen all these different random credit cards. They were cards he'd applied for using the data that he knew of his friends and very close friends. He'd even applied for joint accounts with a few of them and obviously got them because the cards were there, and they were all within about an 18-month period because you could tell from the expiry dates of them all. So it wasn't simply that he kept ringing up saying he'd lost a card or, anything like that. It was all separate accounts. And I think what it does is, what we've got to remember as well is the particular financial institution, I know they're head of fraud now, and I'm very safe to say, I don't think he'd be able to do this now. I think their controls have increased and, dramatically. But what he did was he took advantage of maybe immature controls at a time in the growth of this particular fintech where it was still quite young. And I think this is a lesson. He's a really good lesson actually for any fintechs that are emerging or in that phase of early customer acquisition where perhaps your KYC or know your customer is not maybe up to that of the tier one banks or, your traditional banks. And he definitely exploited, I think, the loopholes at that time. So I'm confident to say I don't think he would be able to achieve this now. So we were there to talk about like what he might have done with those. So I explained to them about money laundering and about that opening these accounts themselves wasn't, yes, it's their fraudulent accounts. They don't belong to him. He's using someone else's data, but they were not credit bearing accounts. So he couldn't have got money out of these accounts. They were used for money laundering, so that he would have been defrauding other people and putting the money into those accounts to keep it away from him, probably transferring them across. So it explained the role of what a money mule looks like. And in this case, he'd used the data of his friends and family to act as money mules to be able to get the fraudulent data that we know he'd scammed out of Glastonbury tickets and, you know, and I'm sure other things. The key thing, and I think this is one of the things as a criminologist that it seems really obvious to me, but perhaps not to people who are not from our world in fraud and financial crime or from crime itself, is they said, well, we think he's stopped now. I said, why? Is he in prison? No. I said, is he dead? They were like, no. I was like, is he in some sort of institution where he can't get access to a phone? And they were like, no, we think we know where he is, but he's not doing it anymore. And I was like, right, you're going to have to give me some evidence as to this. And I just said to them, no, this is serious organized crime now. And they were like, no, but he doesn't seem like he just did it to his friends and his family. And I was like, escalation, stop. I was like, unless the guy's dead, he's not stopped. He's just taken on a new identity. And I was like, and that is in the realm when there's a complete stop. That is serious organized crime, because it's so difficult nowadays for anyone to just take on a new identity, particularly here in the UK, particularly in Europe. You know, we're on an island. You've got to get out of it somehow. You know, we, especially in a post-Brexit era, it's harder now for us to travel than it has ever been. The borders used to be open for us everywhere, and now nobody wants us. So it's, you know, him to be able to do that, he has to have a level of identification and that isn't his. And so that in itself brings up loopholes around, you know, we've got big debates around digital ID and what the future of that is. And ultimately, one of the battles for us to deal with serious organised crime is fraudulently obtained originals or fraudulently obtained genuines. They sometimes get called FOGs. And I think that's going to be an increasing issue in the US as well, if it's not something already, because your population size is so vast and you have so many people that do not have passports or forms of digital ID. And then you have those vulnerable people who perhaps know they're never going to travel out of country. They're never maybe even going to have the money to apply for a passport. If they're approached, can I get a passport out in your name and I'll pay you X amount of money? They won't even necessarily realise that once they've lost that passport, they're never going to regain it back, even if they are in a better position later on. It's then random person that's got no way of proving who they are up against a seemingly crystal clear identity that's already been formed. So I think that's potentially all the clues point to that's what he's done, is that he's escalated. He's been almost like a baby fraudster. He's made his mistakes. He's left his trail of evidence, which is what they were able to pick up upon. And as he's got more sophisticated, the evidence trail has dropped. And that's because he's upscaled in terms of what he's involved in financial crime. So if that's obviously all alleged, but that would be my assessment, is that what we were able to watch on BBC Three was an investigation into the formation of a fraudster. But what he's doing today and now, I wouldn't like to guess, because he's been able to pass the kind of tipping point of anonymity into that organised crime world.
The investigation into the formation of a fraudster. That's what the headline should have been. It really is a fascinating story there. And there's an addiction, I'm sure, right? You have some success, you have some benefit and some reward from that. And it just grows upon itself that way.
With someone like him as well, and not to put assertions into his childhood, but when we think about like the making of a fraudster, there is so many different facets. And one of the key things, and again, this is not to say that it is in his case, but it has been in a lot of former fraudsters' cases that I've seen, is that there is a key element. There's a key psychological driver of them wanting to be someone else. There's real low self-esteem, and often that low self-esteem there's a high correlation between careers as fraudsters. So not just you kind of opportunistic, did it once, kind of got away with it, but those who go into lifelong careers in fraud and financial crime have high correlations of child sexual abuse. And so it's that idea of the shame and stigma that they feel about themselves, of being taught from a very young age that lying is okay, that it's not, or that it's not lying, it's just telling a story, it's just putting a spin on it, or what have you, of being able to keep secrets, and also feeling shame and disgust and therefore wanting to be someone else. So there's a real kind of relationship. And I think that when I talk about fraud and financial crime harms us all, and why prevention is better than a cure, and all these different things, is that that's what fraud feeds into, is that it's not dealing with some of the key issues and the key societal issues. It's an indicator that something else is going wrong. And whilst a fraudster may want to defraud you because it releases whatever pressure they feel at that time, it's better for them to not, and for them to have their issues dealt with and not push them onto all of us. You know, fraud harms them in the same way that it harms the victim and harms society. So in terms of like why he's done all of that, I don't know for him. I've never met him, and I would never want to cast aspersions on someone's situation. But from my experience as a criminologist, there's a high correlation between those who go on to commit fraud, who've got what we call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and that ultimately they're running away from who they really are. And really, we would be better placed with trying to help them resolve their childhood issues and not commit more crime than having to kind of hunt them down as fraudsters. When you're dealing with the human side of fraud, you have to be able to look at every facet and not just say fraudsters are bad, victims are good. The fact that fraud's climbing is a real black mark on how we take care of vulnerable people within our society, because some of them go on to be victims of fraud and some of them go on to be perpetrators.
If you could give one piece of advice to fraud prevention teams today, and I know you met recently with the group from Salve and talking to a lot of fraud prevention professionals. If you could give one piece of advice to those teams today, what would it be?
Just one. Wow. So I think the biggest piece of advice I would say is design for the moment of vulnerability and not the ideal user. Fraud prevention professionals should be involved in the design of your products, services, processes. They should be some of the most important people in your organisation. And I don't think that we're necessarily held in that esteem. If you think about it, we have the CISO on the C-suite, but we don't necessarily have the person who's in charge of designing out, fraud and financial crime, or heading that up at that level. So I think that we need to elevate fraud and financial crime into C-suite conversations, and that we need to empower our teams to be able to design for the moment of vulnerability, not the ideal user. We've got to remember that people don't read warnings when they're scared. They don't think rationally when they're rushed. We need to build defenses that assume emotional pressure is already present. Invest time, KPIs, etc. in listening to your customers. Everything that you need to know about preventing fraud is already there. It's already sitting in the stories of the people who've been through it, and it's already sat there in your data. It's about your teams being upskilled, trusted, and empowered to be able to take that knowledge, build on those stories, and design out vulnerability to fraud and financial crime, both out of your systems and processes and out of your customers.
Dr. Nicola Harding, thank you so much for sharing your insights today, for sharing about human behavior, criminology, how we think about fraud, and really understanding and looking at fraud through this lens of human behavior. It's a unique and important perspective, and I appreciate you taking so much time to share it with me and to our listeners. It reminds us that prevention is not just about technology, it's about people on both sides and what we can learn from their experiences. So thank you so much for being with us. And for our listeners, if you would like to learn more about Dr. Harding's work, please check out Financial Crime Lab and her research on behavioral criminology. She's a great follow on LinkedIn. We'll also share some links in the show notes. And as always, thank you for joining us on Experian's Fraud Frontlines podcast series. And we'll see you next time. Nicola, thank you.
Thank you so much.